What's up, guys? Welcome to the Chess Giant. This is Solomon Ordell, and in today's video we're going to be covering the Walrus variation of the Ross Gambit. Now, as we've covered on this channel, there's some bad animal chess openings as well as some good. I would say that this is a bad one, but with some potential. You see what I mean in a minute, but it's really a response against the move knight f3 with the Reti Opening. White oftentimes trying to go into a King's Indian attack type setup with g3, d3, and Fiend shadowing this light squared bishop on g2. But here we're going to throw a wrench in White's plans, because we're not going to play a quiet and really good looking move such as knight f6 or d5, but instead we're going to play one of the two moves that simply offer White material, that being this move e5 with the Ross Gambit, giving White the opportunity to just take this pawn right off the board, in which case we're not going to continue with knight c6. And the key position that we're going to be covering in today's video is against knight takes knight, in which case we play d takes c6, entering into the Walrus variation. Now, the reason I don't say the Walrus is very good is because we're simply down a pawn. And on top of that, White really has no weaknesses to speak of. In fact, none of their pieces or pawns have even moved in this position except for the knight on g1, which obviously no longer exists, and neither does our knight on b8. The only difference being that we do not have an e-pawn while White does, and we now have a pawn on c6. That being said, White can fall into some trouble here if they're not careful. We're going to be covering a few different moves here from White, including e4, d4, g3, and then finally my recommendation for White, which is a very quiet looking move such as d3. But let's first cover this move of e4. Why on earth does the Walrus, which simply gives up a pawn at move 1, have any potential? Well, here now we can play this move of knight f6, and we have just transposed into the Stafford Gambit, one of Eric Rosen's favorite openings, attacking this pawn on e4. And I mean, look, if you were playing in a tournament setting and I walked by the board and I saw this position, I would go, wow, one of my YouTube subscribers is going with the Stafford Gambit. But really, you're playing the Walrus variation. You played this crazy looking move of e5 against the move knight f3, and especially if you're a Stafford Gambit player already, you're loving this transposition, and you're probably going to be much more comfortable than your opponent. There's a ton of different traps that White can fall into, basically 7 main ones, but let's cover a couple of them really quickly, starting off with this move of e5. What happens if White pushes the pawn one square, going, look, I'm up a pawn, why not just start kicking this knight around? And here, after a move like knight e4, play d3. These both seem like very logical options, but all of a sudden, we play this move of bishop c5, and White is simply losing this game. We have a double threat, a double attacking idea against this pawn on f2, and notice how there's really not any good way for White to defend it. White could try a move like bishop e3, but in that case, okay, we're just going to take that bishop off the board and then continue with queen h4 with check. And here, if this king goes up one square, we actually have 2 ways in which we have a mate and one in that position. And here, if we move like g3, okay, let's just take the pawn off the board. Continue now with queen takes h1. We're up the exchange. We have bishop h3 ideas in the air, h5 and h4 ideas in the air, breaking this game open. And we're not far off from this game simply being over. So y'all, if we see a move like bishop e3 trying to stop the threat of bishop takes f2, we're simply going to take that bishop off the board and then continue with queen h4 check. Black there with the crushing edge. And here, if the move d takes e4 is played, White just going, look, I mean, you have a knight in the center of the board, why not just take it? Well, it's because of this idea of bishop takes f2 with check. Whole idea being, if you want to take our bishop, thank you for the queen on d1. And if the move king e2 is played, we play bishop g4 attacking the king, and this king simply cannot hang on to the queen on d1. We're now going to win this queen, and notice how there's really no bishop b5 check ideas in the air, because there is this pawn on c6, and this is not checkers, this is check, so we cannot hop over pieces, unless of course you're knight, but that's not really applicable in this position. So we just covered this position, in which case the Walrus transposed into the Stafford Gambit with knight f6, in which case White plays the move e5 followed by d3. But against this, we're going to play knight e4 followed by bishop c5, and Black there simply has a crushing advantage. Really one game. What happens if White tries to defend the pawn on e4? There's a ton of different traps, including against the move d3, defending the pawn on e4. But let's say we see a move like knight c3. Well, in this case, yet again, we're going to play bishop c5. This is a key idea in the Stafford Gambit, putting some pressure on f2. And by the way, the pawns on f2 and f7 are the weakest pawns in chess, particularly in the opening, because only the kings defend them. And here we would love to play an idea such as knight g4, right? Again, knight g4, double attacking the pawn on f2, and there's simply not going to be a good way for white to defend this. So here white may play a move like bishop e2, in which case, again, we're going to play h5, expanding on the king side, trying to get in this knight g4 idea, attacking the pawn on f2. And if, again, white plays this move of h3, we can now play queen d4, just throwing our queen right into the action, attacking the pawn, threatening a mate in one. Whole idea being, if a move like castling kingside, we're actually just going to throw our knight into g4 anyways. Now, having not a single or double, but triple attack all against that pawn on f2, here white could try to play a move such as queen e1, holding onto that pawn, but in this case, we now have queen e5, threatening a mate in one on h2. This game is nearly over. And notice here, if a move like bishop takes g4, okay, we just take the bishop back, and we have a crushing attack on the king side. If a move like h takes on g4, we're going to take back with the h-pawn, and we now have, again, this idea of queen h2 with checkmate, this time supported by the rook on h8, as this pawn on h3 has simply gone out of the way. And here, if an idea like g3 is played, this move actually doesn't really stop anything. I mean, I guess it technically stops this move of queen h2 checkmate, but only by one move, because we're simply going to take this pawn off the board. And notice how this pawn on f2 is simply pinned to the king on g1. This game is about to be over. So y'all, if we see a move here like queen e1 trying to hang on to this pawn on f2, just play queen e5, and we're going to continue to have great attacking chances, and simply a one game. And if white captures on g4 right away, we're going to play h takes g4 yet again, eyeing this pawn on f2 as always, and really trying to eye this idea of queen e5. For example, let's just say white plays a move here like d3. Okay, we play queen e5, threatening a mate in one, and as always, this pawn on f2 against queen e5 cannot move as it's pinned by the bishop, and this move of g3 does not work because we simply capture it off the board because this pawn is pinned. So here white really needs to play the move g3 right away. That way, against queen e5, white has just enough time to get this king g2 move in, but we now play bishop takes f2, threatening a mate in one. Whole idea being, if king takes f2, we have rook h2 check and queen takes g3. I mean, just chasing that king around. Black there with the simple one game. And here, if the move rook takes f2 is played, it seems as if for a second white has held on, but yet again we have a single move here that gives black the edge, and that is queen h5, threatening queen h2, followed by queen h1 checkmate, game over. And here, if a move like queen g1 trying to stop the threat of queen h2, okay, we'll play queen h3, and this king simply cannot move. We got ourselves yet again a game over. And there's something like rook f4, white desperately trying to get this king some room to run away while holding on to material. We can now play queen h2 with check, followed by queen takes g3, threatening the rook, threatening a mate in one, and white here might as well throw in the towel. So yeah, that covers just a couple of different traps against the move e4, in which case we play knight f6 coming out of the Walrus and transposing into the Stafford Gambit. Those are just two of the main 7 traps that we see a ton in the Stafford Gambit. I actually made a video on the top 7 traps, and I'll leave a link to it at the end of this one. Let's see here white continues with another option such as d4, expanding in the center of the board. I actually think that this is a much better option for white from a practical standpoint. There's a lot less firepower that black has in this position, but yet again, it's still somewhat playable. I mean, we could play a move like knight f6, and here something like e3, we can now use our extra c-pawn and play c5, trying to undermine a little bit and put some pressure on the center of the board. Guys, when you're up in material, you want to try to keep the game very cool, calm, and collected. But when you're down in material, you want to try to create as many inequalities and imbalances in the position as possible. And that's exactly what we're trying to do starting off with this move of c5. We're down in material. Why not go for it and try to make this game interesting? Here, if white decides to take on c5, the whole idea is that we can take on d1. And yes, after bishop takes c5, we are down a pawn still. But here, if a move like bishop d3, notice how our king can castle and this king on d1 cannot. We're going to continue by developing our light squared bishop, putting our rooks on d8 as well as this square of e8, really aiming our back rank pieces right down the center of the board. A move like knight d5 can be played at a moment's notice. And here white with about a +1 advantage, but white can fall into trouble very quickly here if not careful. We do have the edge in development, and we can use that to try to create some counterattacking chances and try to get ourselves a fun middle game position going into the end game. So y'all, if white ever takes this pawn on c5 against a ton of these walrus type positions, okay, let's just trade off queens, take on c5, castle our king, and try to use our remaining pieces to try to create something out of that position, even though white is technically much better. What about a move here like bishop e2? What do we do in the walrus? Well, here we can simply continue by snatching off that centralized pawn, and yet again, naturally developing our pieces. Let's not play a move like bishop e7, somewhat passive. Let's play bishop d6, aiming directly towards the king side of the board, and now simply continue with a move like castling kingside. If we ever see an option like c4, let's play c6 just so that against c5 we have somewhere to go with our bishop. We're now going to continue with options such as queen c7. By the way, both of our bishops pouncing down on the king side of the board. We're going to continue by putting our rooks on e8 as well as d8. I'm just again taking down those centralized files. A move like knight e4 can be played at a moment's notice. And here black yet again with a technically worse position, but things can go south for white very quickly if they're not careful. So y'all, if you see a move here like d4, just continue with knight f6 and c5. Again, the Walrus guy is not a top tier opening, not going to work against someone like Magnus Carlsen. I mean, not going to lie, what really would work, right, against Magnus Carlsen, unless you're Magnus Carlsen himself, but you get the point. I mean, this opening isn't following high-level GM theory. We're really just trying to give up a pawn and in return, try to develop our pieces as quickly as possible and try to create something out of that. I do want to mention, if white plays a move here like g3, that we should play this idea of h5, right? Expanding on the king side of the board. Whole idea being have something like bishop g2. We then have h4, putting pressure on g3 with h3 ideas, attacking that light squared bishop. Again, trying to create as many imbalances in this game as we possibly can. And you know, oftentimes in a position like this, you'll see the opponent play a move like h3. Whole idea being against h4, the opponent can then play this move of g4. It seems to kind of solidify the positioning of these pawns and make this whole h5, h4 idea a total waste of time. But in this position, notice how underdeveloped white is. We're going to continue to put the pressure on white with this move of f5. Whole idea being if g takes f5, we can simply continue with queen d5, attacking the rook on h1. If a move like f3, we can actually just continue with bishop d6 ideas in the air, threatening bishop g3 with checkmate. And if this rook moves, okay, let's get one of our pawns back. And here's something like d3 threatening e4. Let's drop our queen back to e6, threatening this pawn on h3, which, by the way, if we capture this off, we're going to have a passed pawn on the h-file, only 3 moves away from promotion, as white doesn't even have a single piece off of the back rank. And again, a very fun and interesting position to work with here for black. So I just want to mention, if you see a move here such as g3, I mean, white just trying to keep the peace, play h5 and h4, try to create as much ruckus as you can on the king side, and you're going to have yourself a pretty fun game to work with. But guys, I wanted to finish off this video by covering my personal recommendation for white on what to do against the Walrus Variation. If you see this move, what do you think the best option is for white to go with? Well, we did cover a couple of good different lines following this move of d4, and on top of that, even with this move e4 against knight f6, white does have the better game. They just have to be very careful against the Stafford Gambit and not falling into one of those many traps. But personally, from a practical standpoint, I'm going to be recommending this option of d3. The computer really likes this move, but more than that, I think that this is just a solid option, which really doesn't give black much to work with. I mean, here, if we play a move like bishop c5, okay, let's just limit the activity of that bishop with e3. And here, if we see something like bishop e6, white can now play knight d2. And against queen d7, there's actually a couple different things that white can do here. White could just continue with a move such as g3, right? Trying to fiend shadow that bishop, continue with knight f3, and get a somewhat normal version of that King's Indian attack with only a couple temples lost. Or white could just continue with a move such as e3, followed by b3, almost trying to play a hippopotamus defense type setup, but with the white pieces, continuing now with moves such as bishop b2, trying to take control of this very key long diagonal. And again, white here just trying to play slow and methodical chess, developing the pieces, but not giving black any targets to go after. If you do face an opponent that may have seen this video on what to do against the Walrus, you could try an idea here such as f5, continue to develop your pieces, and then potentially f4, right? Trying to put some pressure on that pawn on e3. Your job as black here is to create some weaknesses and try to get after this king as much as you can. Right now, white has a very solid setup with really no weaknesses to speak of, so we got to try to make some. We got to play a move like f5, followed by a soon f4, or even start playing moves like h5, h4, and h3, depending on what white does on the king side, and if white commits to a castling king side. Needless to say, the Walrus Variation definitely does have its flaws, but it is fun and can give you some very interesting games. Thanks for watching today's video. If you'd like to learn the top 7 Stafford Gambit traps, the video that I was talking about earlier, click that video to the left. If you'd like to see our entire animal openings playlist, click that playlist to the right. Leave a comment down below. Let me know what other videos you'd like to see covered on this channel. And as always, I appreciate you guys. Thanks for watching. Peace.